Some people believe the worst moment in a marriage is when you realize it's over. They're wrong. The worst moment is when you discover exactly who you've been sharing a bed with for 30 years. Charles came home to an empty house, an open safe, and a note that said she was gone. The cash was gone, the jewelry was gone, the bonds were gone. She'd cleaned out everything before filing for divorce. What Deborah didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the safe had a false bottom. And beneath it sat the real holdings, property deeds, the bulk of the bonds, and a separate account passbook he'd quietly maintained for years. She took the deed, and in doing so, she handed him the one piece of evidence that would cost her everything. This is Charles Harwood, a 68-year-old retired engineer who spent his career studying structural failures. He learned long ago that the most dangerous cracks are the ones you can't see. When his wife Deborah emptied their safe and vanished just before serving divorce papers, she thought she'd taken everything. But Charles had a habit of building redundancies into every system. What she missed beneath that false bottom wasn't just money, it was leverage, and the question is, what will he do with it? Charles Harwood was a man who spent his entire career preparing for the worst. As a structural engineer, he'd inspected bridges after earthquakes, buildings after fires, dams after record rainfall. He understood something most people never think about. Failure doesn't announce itself. It hides in a hairline crack, a corroded joint, a single bolt that someone forgot to tighten. And by the time you see it, it's already too late. He brought this same philosophy home. Not in a paranoid way, just a quiet, private diligence that most people mistook for being a little old-fashioned. His wife Deborah certainly did. They'd been married nearly 18 years, a second marriage for both, built on comfort and companionship more than grand passion. She called him predictable. He preferred the word prepared. 12 years earlier, while they were on a 2-week trip to visit her sister in Florida, someone broke into their house. The burglars took Deborah's jewelry, a few thousand in cash from the bedroom drawer, some old stock certificates, and a lockbox that contained both their wills and the deed to the property. The sense of violation lingered long after the insurance check arrived. So Charles did what an engineer does. He bought a floor safe, a heavy steel box rated to survive a house fire, and he hired a contractor to sink it into the concrete slab beneath their bedroom closet floor. But Charles didn't stop there. He'd seen too many systems fail because they relied on a single point of protection. He fabricated a false bottom inside the safe himself, a removable steel panel lined with felt, perfectly flush, invisible unless you knew exactly where to press. On the top layer went a modest stack of cash, some bonds, and a few pieces of jewelry they rarely wore. It was the deed, a target obvious enough to satisfy anyone who cracked the combination. Beneath it, in the hidden compartment, he placed the real holdings, the bulk of their retirement bonds, property deeds, and a separate passbook linked to a credit union account he'd opened years before they even married. He never told Deborah, not because he distrusted her back then, but because compartmentalization was simply how his mind worked. You don't advertise your redundancies, that defeats the point. In the years that followed, the safe faded into the background of their daily lives. Deborah rarely even looked at it. She trusted Charles to handle the finances, which he did with the same methodical care he applied to everything. But beneath the surface of that quiet domestic routine, something was shifting. Deborah began retreating into long phone calls with her sister, the conversations falling silent when Charles walked into the room. She started mentioning Florida more often, suggesting they sell the house and move somewhere warmer. Charles resisted, not stubbornly, just practically. The house was paid off. The property taxes were low. Moving made no financial sense. He thought it was a discussion. He didn't realize it was a grievance being tallied. The real change came about 6 months before she left. Deborah grew increasingly distant, then angry in ways Charles couldn't trace to any specific argument. She accused him of being cold, controlling, emotionally absent. When he asked what was wrong, she'd wave him off or blame stress. What Charles didn't know, what he wouldn't learn until later, was that Deborah had already consulted a divorce attorney. And the attorney had given her one piece of advice that she followed to the letter. Before filing, secure what you can. Cash, valuables, anything liquid that won't leave an immediate paper trail. Deborah thought she had time. She thought Charles was oblivious. She thought the safe contained everything that mattered. On a Thursday afternoon in early autumn, Charles returned from a routine medical appointment to find the house too quiet. Her car was gone. Her side of the closet was half empty. On the kitchen counter sat a handwritten note, brief and almost businesslike. "I can't do this anymore. I've taken what's fair. My lawyer will be in touch." There was no signature, just the faint indentation of her pen on the paper. His first instinct was to check the bedroom closet. The safe door was wide open, the keypad blinking idly. The top tray had been swept clean. Cash, jewelry, bearer bonds, all vanished. For a moment he felt the old cold rush of violation, the same feeling from 12 years ago. And then, standing in the quiet house, the empty safe at his feet, Charles Harwood did something that would have looked utterly insane to anyone watching. He smiled, because Deborah had taken the decoy. And the real fortune, along with every piece of legal leverage he would ever need, was still exactly where he'd left it, hidden in plain sight, inches beneath her emptied tray, waiting. Charles didn't stand there smiling for long. He knelt down, pressed the hidden catch, a small depression near the back corner of the safe floor, and lifted the false bottom panel. Beneath it, exactly as he'd left them years ago, lay the real holdings. The property deed for the house, the one she thought she'd force him to sell. A stack of bearer bonds worth over $400,000, far more than the modest bundle she'd taken. And a blue passbook from a credit union in Charleston, its balance showing a number she'd never seen on any joint statement. He removed each item carefully, checking the dates and serial numbers. They were intact, untouched. And legally, they were positioned to be considered his separate property, acquired before marriage or through inheritance. She had taken the bait and left him the prize. Within the hour, Charles was on the phone with Alan Keswick, a family law attorney who'd handled his neighbor's divorce a few years back. Alan was a careful man, the kind who asked questions before offering opinions. Charles described the scene, the empty safe, the missing DK assets, the false bottom she never knew about. Alan listened without interruption, then said something that made Charles's jaw tighten with a grim kind of satisfaction. "Charles, what she just did is textbook dissipation. She cleaned out marital assets without consent in preparation for divorce. The court is not going to like that," he went on. "We need to document everything. Photograph the safe, the hidden compartment, the items you still have. Do not touch or move them until I get a forensic accountant involved. And keep that note she left. It's evidence." Charles had already taken pictures with his phone, but he would do it again with a dated camera as Alan instructed. He asked about the separate credit union account. Alan clarified, "If you can show that the funds in that account are traceable to premarital assets or an inheritance, it's your separate property. The fact that you kept it quiet doesn't make it marital, but we need to disclose it fully in your financial affidavit. No surprises from our side. Let her be the one with the secrets." While Charles was methodically building his legal fortress, Deborah Harwood was 1,200 miles away in Tampa, sitting on her sister's patio with a glass of Chardonnay, feeling like she'd just pulled off the heist of the century. The cash from the safe was already in a new account she'd opened at a local bank. The jewelry she'd taken to a pawn shop for an appraisal, though she had no intention of selling, they were hers, or so she believed. The bonds she'd cashed, less than $10,000 total, enough for a comfortable cushion while the divorce ground through the courts. She told her sister that Charles would never see it coming, that he was too predictable, too trusting. She had planned it for months. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Charles had been preparing for this moment long before she'd ever consulted a lawyer. 6 days after her departure, the divorce petition landed in Charles's mailbox. The document was clinical: irreconcilable differences, a request for equitable distribution of marital property, and a motion for temporary spousal support. The accompanying financial affidavit from Deborah listed her assets modestly: a small retirement account, some personal property, no mention of the safe's contents she had taken. She was claiming the cash and bonds had been her separate property, gifts from Charles over the years. It was a lie, but one that would need to be disproven. Alan reviewed the petition with Charles in his office. "She's either very confident or very foolish. By not disclosing those assets as marital, she's already set herself up for a fraud finding. When we prove she emptied the safe, the court can deduct that exact amount from her share of the marital estate. It's called a dissipation claim. And if we can show she lied on her financial affidavit, it's perjury, which poisons everything else she says." He tapped the note she'd written. "This note says I've taken what's fair. That's an admission that she took something and she didn't disclose it. It's a gift to us." Charles felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. He hadn't wanted a war, but now that it was here, he would not be a casualty. Over the next several weeks, the discovery process began. Interrogatories flew between attorneys. Deborah's lawyer, a local Tampa attorney who specialized in quick settlements, demanded full financial disclosure from Charles and made vague threats about hidden assets, unaware of the irony. Charles's team, now including a forensic accountant named Dr. Evelyn Sharp, compiled every record. They traced the origin of the credit union account back to an inheritance from Charles's mother in the mid-90s, well before he met Deborah, proving it was not a marital asset. They catalogued the bonds and property deeds with meticulous care. Then came the moment that Alan had been waiting for. Charles's formal financial disclosure was due. He listed every asset he held, including the full contents of the safe, noting that the decay layer had been removed by his wife without his knowledge, and that the remaining items, the substantial bonds, the deeds, and the separate account, were still in his possession. He attached photographs of the safe, the false bottom, and the untouched compartment. The disclosure was a bombshell delivered in manila envelope. When the document arrived at Deborah's lawyer's office and was forwarded to her, she read it 3 times, her hands trembling. The bond total alone was nearly $500,000. The house she thought would be sold was deeded solely to Charles, acquired from his late father's estate, another separate property. The credit union account held enough to fund a retirement she had no claim to. She had stolen a few $1,000s and some trinkets, but the real fortune had been inches beneath her fingertips the whole time. And now, the legal noose was tightening around her own neck. Her midnight raid was about to become the weapon that dismantled her entire case. That was when Deborah Harwood realized she hadn't just underestimated her husband, she had walked straight into a trap that had been waiting for 12 years. Deborah Harwood sat in her sister's kitchen, the document from Charles's attorney spread across the marble island, and for the first time since she'd driven out of that driveway, she felt actual terror. It wasn't just the money. It was the realization that everything she'd planned, every smug conversation she'd had with her sister about how easy it was to outwit a man who spent more time with blueprints than people, had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of who she'd married. Charles hadn't been oblivious. He'd been watching, preparing, and she had handed him the rope. Her first instinct was to fight fire with fire. She called her lawyer, a fast-talking Tampa attorney named Marcus Price, who had handled several acrimonious divorces in her sister's social circle. She told him Charles was hiding assets, that the false bottom proved he'd been concealing money from her for years, that he must have moved things after she left to make her look guilty. Marcus saw an opportunity for a counterclaim. "We can argue he hid community property," he said. "If he had a secret compartment, he was the one committing fraud. The safe was in your marital home. You had every right to its contents. He's the one who didn't disclose." But that argument hit a wall almost immediately. During her deposition, Deborah was asked under oath, "When you opened the safe on the day you left, did you know about a false bottom?" She had to answer truthfully, "No." So they asked, "Had you ever seen the false bottom before?" Again, "No." Then Alan, Charles's attorney, presented the receipt for the safe's installation and a dated photograph of the safe interior, taken just after installation, showing the false bottom already in place. The date stamp was 8 years before she left, so the compartment was there during the entire marriage, and she had simply never known about it. That killed her claim that Charles had recently hidden assets. You can't claim a spouse concealed community property when the property was in a compartment you had daily access to and just never checked. The judge would see it as her own negligence, not his deception. Then came the forensic accountant's report. Dr. Evelyn Sharp had traced the origin of every asset in that hidden compartment. The bonds were purchased with funds from an inheritance Charles received from his mother in 1994, predating the marriage by over a decade. The property deed was from his father's estate, also premarital. The credit union account was opened in 1998 and had never been commingled with marital funds. Every cent was legally separate. Even the items in the decay tray she took, the cash and jewelry, were marital, purchased during the marriage with joint funds, and she had removed them without consent. Evelyn's report was 140 pages of financial annihilation, but the real blow landed during the disclosure of Deborah's own financial records. Under subpoena, her bank produced statements showing the new account in Tampa with a deposit matching the exact amount of cash from the safe. Her pawnshop appraisal receipt for the jewelry surfaced, and the cashed bonds left a paper trail directly to her. She had lied on her sworn financial affidavit, which she had signed under penalty of perjury. Alan filed an immediate motion for sanctions, citing dissipation, fraud on the marital estate, and perjury. He requested that the court award Charles 100% of the dissipated assets, plus attorney's fees, and refer the matter for criminal investigation. Marcus Price, now realizing his client had been less than honest with him, scrambled to negotiate. He contacted Alan and proposed a settlement. Deborah would return the assets she took, waive any claim to spousal support, and accept a split of the marital home's equity. Alan listened, then calmly asked, "The home is deeded solely to Charles as separate property. There is no marital equity to split. Your client has already admitted that in writing when she said she'd taken what's fair." "What exactly are you offering?" There was a long silence on the line. Deborah had bet on the wrong pile of assets, and now the house she'd lived in for nearly 2 decades was legally not hers at all. Charles owned it outright, free of any marital claim. Her midnight escape had cost her not just the loot, but any legal ground to even ask for the roof over her head. When Marcus relayed this to Deborah, she broke down. Her sister's support began to fray. The sister's husband, a retired accountant himself, looked at the numbers and quietly told his wife, "She's going to lose terribly, and the legal fees could ruin her." Suddenly, the safe haven of Tampa felt less welcoming. Deborah found herself isolated, facing the prospect of returning to a small town where everyone would know what she'd done, or starting over with nothing, her own retirement depleted by legal bills and her share of the marital estate potentially zeroed out. The final hearing on the dissipation motion was set. Charles's lawyer had laid out a simple, devastating timeline. Exhibit A, the note in Deborah's handwriting acknowledging she took assets. Exhibit B, her financial affidavit failing to disclose those assets. Exhibit C, the photographs of the safe, the false bottom, and the untouched compartments. Exhibit D, the forensic tracing proving the bulk of the wealth was separate property. The narrative was airtight. A woman who attempted to strip her husband of his life's work, only to discover that the real treasure was hidden beneath a decoy she was too eager to grab, and that in her haste, she had handed him every legal weapon he needed to protect what was always his. As the hearing date approached, Charles Harwood sat in his living room, the very house Deborah had tried to walk away from, and reviewed the case file one last time. He felt no triumph, only a quiet vindication. He had spent his career reinforcing structures so they wouldn't collapse under pressure. Now the structure of his life, though shaken, had held, and the woman who tried to tear it down was about to learn the price of pulling the wrong thread. The judge's gavel would fall in 3 days. The courtroom was a sterile rectangle of fluorescent light and polished wood, the kind of room where lives are reduced to line items and sworn statements. Charles sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a simple gray suit he'd owned for 20 years. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had nothing to hide. Deborah sat across the aisle, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the empty bench where the judge would soon appear. She had aged noticeably in the weeks since her deposition, the confident glow replaced by a tight, exhausted sharpness around the mouth. Her sister was not in the gallery. Neither was Marcus Price, who had filed a motion to withdraw as counsel 3 days prior, citing irreconcilable differences with his own client after she'd admitted to lying on her affidavit. A public defender sat at her side now, young and visibly overwhelmed. Judge Elaine Cross entered without ceremony, a woman in her late 60s with a reputation for zero tolerance of financial gamesmanship in her courtroom. She reviewed the case file for a full minute before speaking, the silence pressing down on everyone. Then she looked directly at Deborah. "Ms. Harwood, I have before me a dissipation claim, a sanctions motion, and a referral request for perjury. Before I rule, do you have anything to say?" Deborah's voice, when it came, was thin. She said she had been scared, that she felt she had no choice, that Charles had controlled everything. It was a weak script, and it crumbled under the judge's next question. "He controlled everything. How did you manage to open the safe, remove the contents, and drive 1,200 miles without his knowledge? That doesn't sound like control. That sounds like a plan." The hearing proceeded in a series of quiet detonations. Alan called Dr. Evelyn Sharp, who walked the court through the forensic tracing with the calm precision of a surgeon. The bonds, the deed, the credit union account, all separate property, all premarital or inherited. The assets Deborah took. Cash from a joint account, jewelry purchased during the marriage, bonds acquired with marital funds. Alan then introduced the note, blown up on a screen for the courtroom. "I've taken what's fair." Underneath it, in bold text, he had added a simple question: if it was fair, why didn't she disclose it? Then came the moment that no one except Charles and Alan anticipated. Charles stood to testify, but before he spoke directly about the dissipation, Alan asked a procedural question. "Mr. Harwood, did you have any reason to suspect your wife might attempt to remove assets prior to her departure?" Charles nodded. "I had a feeling, not proof, just a feeling. After the burglary years ago, I installed a small motion-activated camera inside the safe. It runs on a battery and records to a local card. I don't check it regularly. But after she left, I reviewed the footage." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Deborah's face went pale. Alan submitted the footage into evidence. The screen flickered, and there was Deborah kneeling at the closet safe, punching in the code with the speed of someone who had rehearsed it. She lifted the top tray, paused to count the cash, then swept it all into a black bag, her expression calm, efficient, entirely without hesitation. The timestamp matched the day she disappeared. The footage lasted only 3 minutes, but it destroyed any remaining pretense that her actions were impulsive or justified. It was premeditated, methodical, and deeply damning. Judge Cross did not take long to deliberate. She ruled from the bench. The dissipation claim was granted in full. The assets taken were valued at $34,000. That amount would be deducted from Deborah's share of the marital estate, which, since the bulk of Charles's assets was separate property, amounted to a few $1,000s in jointly held household goods and a small shared savings account. The result, Deborah's share was effectively zero. Furthermore, the judge found her financial affidavit contained material falsehoods, and she was sanctioned an additional $15,000 in attorney's fees payable to Charles. The motion for referral to the district attorney for perjury was denied, but only because Charles, through Alan, requested mercy. "My client does not wish to pursue criminal charges," Alan said. "He simply wants what is his and closure." Outside the courtroom, the afternoon sun was harsh and unseasonably warm. Deborah walked out alone, clutching a manila envelope of documents that added up to nothing. She did not look at Charles. A cab was waiting at the curb, and she climbed in without a word, heading back to Tampa, where her sister had made it clear the guest room was no longer available. She would rent a small apartment, find a job at a retail store, and spend the next several years understanding that the safe she'd opened was never the one that mattered. The real vault was the quiet diligence of a man who had spent a lifetime preparing for the worst, and who had, in the end, simply outlasted the storm. Charles returned to the house alone, the same house that was now legally and entirely his. He knelt by the safe one last time, not out of paranoia, but out of a kind of reverence. The false bottom was still there, its felt lining slightly worn from the weight of years. He removed the panel, looked at the empty compartment, and for the first time in months, he felt no weight at all. He replaced the panel, closed the safe, and locked it. The keypad beeped its confirmation. He would keep the safe, he decided, not because he needed it anymore, but because it was a monument to a simple truth he'd never forgotten. The strongest defense isn't a wall. It's a false door that makes your enemy think they've already won. What Charles understood, and what most of us only learn the hard way, is that the people who appear the most ordinary are often the ones who see the board most clearly. He didn't win because he was ruthless. He won because he was ready. For years, the safe in that closet looked like a simple box, but underneath the obvious layer, underneath what anyone else would have taken at face value, was the quiet architecture of a man who had already lived through one break-in and decided never to be a victim again. She took what she could see. He kept what mattered. That is not just a divorce story. That is a life philosophy. Question worth sitting with is this: how many of us are living on the surface of our own lives, mistaking the decoy for the real thing? How often do we reach for the easiest grab, only to miss the deeper wealth waiting inches below? Charles Harwood spent his career studying what makes structures fail. He learned that the things that hold up longest are the ones with hidden reinforcements, the redundancies nobody claps for, the bolts you don't see. And when the earthquake came, his life didn't collapse. It held. Deborah walked away with a bag of glitter and a decade of regret. Charles stayed home with the foundation she never knew was there. The safe is still in that closet, still locked, still waiting for a threat that will likely never come. But that is precisely why it will always be ready. If this story stuck with you, do us one quick favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. It costs nothing, and it genuinely helps more stories like this reach people who need to hear them. Thank you for being here. Until next time, keep your own false bottom secure and never mistake the decoy for the real thing.